Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the E-Commerce Edge with me, your host, Jason Greenwood. And I would like to reintroduce my co-host slash guest for this episode of the podcast, Mr. Sam Gupta from both Elevatiq as well as WBS Rocks podcast. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you so much, Jason. Always fun to be with you.
Look, this is so fun, and we're now in episode 2 of our 3 or 4 part, let's see how it goes, 3 or 4 part series about ERP for B2B. So ERP in the context of manufacturers, wholesalers, and distributors. What does that look like? And in our first episode, so this is episode 2 in the series, and in the first episode, the first thing we did was start to outline the ERP use cases for manufacturers and distributors. What are the benefits, at what stage of your life cycle as a business can you really start to justify the implementation of an ERP? And we talked about inflection points, mainly around revenue inflection points. And we talked about the fact that about $10 million worth of annual revenues, that's the point where most manufacturers, wholesalers, and distributors can start to justify or think about the implementation of an ERP or enterprise resource planning system within their business. We talked a little bit about building the business case internally for ERP. Why ERP? What are the value drivers of an ERP in the business? What are the differences between ERPs? What are ERP light systems like a Sin7 or a Bright Pearl? What are some of the typical modules that we would find within an ERP system? And we talked about tangential, components like CRM, like HRM, and even e-procurement. Sometimes these ERP systems will have e-procurement modules in them. Sometimes they will, they'll have demand planning modules within them. Sometimes those are separate systems. Sometimes they're internal systems. So we started to talk about what does ERP, where does ERP begin and where does ERP end? Where is ERP appropriate? Where is it not appropriate? Those were some of the topics that we covered in the very first episode. Now, the second episode, we're going to cover off some more ERP basics. So before we even make a decision about ERP, before we go into implementation of an ERP with an ERP partner, how can we set ourselves up for project success? What are the unique challenges and opportunities around ERP for manufacturers, wholesalers, and distributors? What are some of those, strategic benefits that, go above and beyond, oh, cool, I'm at $10 million, so now I need an ERP. How is an ERP going to bring tangible value to our business? Then we're going to get into some of the steps for ERP selection. So how do I determine which ERP is right for me? How do I determine whether I want an on-premise or a cloud ERP? ERP comes in all different shapes and sizes, from vertical specific ERPs to on-prem ERPs to full SaaS ERPs. And then we want to talk about what are some of the selection criteria that should probably be in our consideration set. So what is the ease of implementation, the average time to get live on a given ERP? Sometimes we need to get live quick. Sometimes 3 months, 6 months is all we've got. If we've got an ERP that's a heavy duty ERP and it's going to take us 18 months to get live, well, maybe that ERP should be out of our consideration set. What is the user experience of that ERP? And the ability to integrate an ERP to other internal and external systems becomes absolutely paramount as of 2025. Basically, if your ERP is kind of standalone and it's an island, it's probably not going to bring as much value to your business as if it's easily integratable with other systems, getting data in, getting data out, and basically being the traffic cop of enterprise data within the business. So these are the topics we're going to start off with today. But what I would like to ask you is that, as part and parcel of that question about how to set yourself up for ERP success, what are the pitfalls that you see a lot of the businesses, manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors that you work with across ERP selection? What do they usually get wrong? What are the things that straight out of the gate they get wrong on a regular basis that you say, man, if they could right at the very start of this process, if they could get this one thing or these two things right, they would have a much greater likelihood of project success? Because I can tell you from my personal experience, and I don't know if this is true for you, of all the major enterprise platforms that I have been a part of implementing over the years, ERP is the one that has the greatest likelihood of project failure. And literally pull the pin, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through an implementation, businesses will literally pull the pin and say, hell no, we are not even going to continue with this because it's too much of a nightmare for our business.
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying a couple of things. So number one comment that you made is ERP is likely to fail the most. And the reason why it is likely to fail the most is because it is supposed to have the most traffic rules. So now depending upon, and I think I mentioned traffic rules before as well. So depending upon how many different traffic rules do you want to have? And the traffic rules are going to be dictated by, how much consolidation are we looking at from the transaction perspective? Whether you want to play as a team or do you want to play silo, as the department. If each departments are sort of playing alone and then they are trying to figure out, okay, whatever happens, that becomes sort of the back end. That's one process, right? So this is the decision that you have to make. Now, biggest pitfall always that we see in our engagements. Okay. These customers come to us and they are like, okay, I want ERP. Great idea. And there are going to be 5-6 people who are going to come, one guy, VP of operations, CFO, controller, marketing guy, supply chain. Everybody's super excited. We want ERP. Give me ERP. All right, we'll give you ERP. Okay. The next question I'm going to have for all of you is, please define what an ERP is for you. And they are going to have many versions of definitions, the way they think of ERP. Obviously, everybody wants some sort of magic wand. That's not how ERPs are supposed to work. So number one thing that every business should be thinking is align the understanding of ERP, what an ERP means to everybody in the company and what you are trying to get out of that. The next phase is going to be to build the target operating model. Okay, there is a term for that. So target operating model, the way it works is you are going to have your as-is processes, you are going to have your to-be process. Okay, regardless of what the community is saying or the internet is saying that, system is supposed to be customizable or whatever. No enterprise software category. I don't know a system. Okay, I don't care how easy it is. Every enterprise software category is very hard to customize. Okay, even if you are able to customize, you are going to find other challenges. For example, you might not know how much you might impact the licensing. That may have implications either today or that's going to be tomorrow as well. So again, the reason why consultants generally discourage companies to not think about customization, I don't care which category it is, whether it is going to be ERP, FP&A, some systems are going to be exactly slightly easier because they don't necessarily touch the operational layer. When you start touching the operational transaction, that's where it becomes difficult because it has real impact on your operations, on your transactions. So those systems are going to be slightly harder. Again, fundamentally, there is nothing wrong about ERP. So going back to your question, first thing, align the understanding. Align every single definition that you have to utilize to enable this overarching thing called ERP. Okay, whatever data sets that you are using, the understanding that you are going to have in your heads. For example, whatever you call a project or SKU or product or customer or vendor
or a customer, okay, or an account.
Exactly. So you need to align the definition of that and define what it means for everybody and what is going to be the data structure of all of those, in the as-is process as well as to be process. Now that takes time. And wherever you are going to have deviations, whether from process perspective or from data perspective, that's where you are going to run into issues. Your immediate choice is going to be technical problem. These technical people are going to be really smart, super sharp. They should be able to figure it out. Okay, you go back, you start customizing, and sometimes it's very hard for technical people to be able to see the implications of those things. So they start with this journey, and sometimes they don't even know when they are going to get lost. And they are lost to an extent that becomes more of the uncontrollable problem. So again, if you want to have simple life, if you want to simplify the process, simplify everything from your process perspective as well as from your data perspective. Once you have that down, aligned, agreed with all the parties, then becomes the whole enterprise architecture piece, because enterprise architecture is supposed to be slightly downstream from what you have decided here from the process and data perspective. Now, this is a very iterative process. Okay, it goes in circles. So once you move or change one variable, whether it is going to be from the system perspective, data perspective, or the process perspective, everything is kind of interconnected.
It's
So
linked.
exactly. So you have to go back again and again, and even anytime you are going to put any sort of constraints. Okay, marketing is not agreeing that that I don't want to deal with any chart of accounts. I don't want to see these accounting errors. Okay,
I don't care. Doesn't affect
right?
me.
Exactly, because it does not affect their job. They don't necessarily have the implications. It's very upstream for them, right? So for them, it's just not meaningful, and that's why you get that resistance. But let's say if you want to have an ERP, and depending upon which transactions you are touching, in general, marketing is very far off from the ERP. So generally, they are probably going to be okay. They never have to deal with the ERP, to be completely honest. The only time when they are probably going to require ERP is they are going to ask, hey, I don't want to touch ERP, but I definitely want my data. Okay, give me
I
data.
definitely especially want my product data to be
Exactly.
accurate coming out of the
Exactly.
ERP. I especially want the data that comes then into my PIM system that I then enrich further to be accurate. And then I definitely want the data I present to my customer to be
Yeah.
accurate. Well,
Yeah.
if it originates in the ERP and you don't want anything to do with ERP, you're probably going to set yourself up for trouble.
Exactly. And I think there is a little myth and confusion, especially around the thing called bi-directional sync. Okay, that's a hot term. Everybody wants bi-directional,
Real
sync.
time,
Real
bidirectional sync.
time. Give me real time bi-directional sync, right? So the reality is that if you look at QuickBooks and a lot of SaaS categories, and the newer ones are even worse, to be completely honest. Okay, the reason why they are able to do the whole bi-directional sync is because they have removed all of those underlying traffic rules. Okay, it's possible in the marketing world, in the martech world, okay, in the QuickBooks world, but you are removing those traffic rules and they have implications. They might be okay until that $10 million stage that we talk about. After that, it becomes fun because your inventory is going to have issues. You are going to have reconciliation issues. You are going to have data integrity issues. Your data is never going to be reliable. So and once you introduce those traffic rules, now your bidirectional sync is not going to work, because now you are getting into the real IT enterprise architecture. And that's why people say
The ERP may need to wait from data from a third-party system before it can do the next step in the chain. So let's maybe talk about a practical example of this. So one of the things that ERPs, in my experience, oftentimes own is order management. They may not own warehouse management, they may not own other aspects of commerce, etc., but
yeah,
they oftentimes are responsible for order and inventory management. So
yeah,
they are responsible for understanding what do we have in stock, where do we have it in stock, and where should the request for fulfillment be routed when we receive an order. So let's say I've got 3 warehouses, 2 of them are owned, one of
yeah,
them's a 3PL, and I have some overlap between SKUs. Some SKUs exist only in one location, but they don't exist in all locations. Sometimes some of my customers may be able to access inventory from all locations. Sometimes they'll only be able to access inventory from a default location. All of these rules around order orchestration, for lack of
yeah,
a better term,
yeah,
oftentimes those rules need to live in the ERP. But if you come from a QuickBooks world
yeah,
where there's no concept of order management, there's no concept of inventory management, there's no concept of order orchestration. If you go from a QuickBooks scenario where every single order and the way that it is routed is manually managed by a human being, and they know the rules of routing in their own mind,
yeah,
and therefore they're able to push the order manually into whatever system needs to do the fulfillment. Now, all of a sudden, if you want to automate that
yeah,
because the ERP has the capability to automate it with traffic rules,
yeah,
well, now all of a sudden, we got to get those rules outside the human being's head. We've got to get them
yeah.
documented, and we have to replicate those rules inside the ERP instead. So I think this is what when you refer to current state versus future state, it's like, okay, the person who's in charge of order management, Bob down in I don't know. He could be working in the warehouse. He could be
Joe,
working in,
Sam,
well,
Jason.
whatever. It could be whatever, right? This guy or this woman is responsible for all manual order management. And so if I go in and I'm talking to Bob or Jane and I'm saying, okay, explain to me today, because it's all manual. Explain to me how you decide today where to route an order to for fulfillment, or how you split an order to be fulfilled by 3 different locations, for example. And how do you get that information back into the business so that you can communicate it to the customer, right? In terms of expected time of delivery, the different tracking details. Walk me through the manual process that you do today, all the way from the point where an order is received to the point where it's received by the customer and potentially returned by the customer. What is every single step in the chain that you do with a human being today? Explain that to me, and explain how you make those decisions. And only then, and only if they have that very clearly articulated, can then someone like you or me come in and say, well, that's awesome, Bob or Jane. We can now translate those rules that are inside your head into a digital equivalent. We can translate those rules into something that is now automatable and scalable. And these are the types of things that I think many businesses, when I go in and do discovery, even if the CEO or the founder of the company is in discovery, which shows a high level of engagement to the project, oftentimes when Bob or Jane start to speak and they start to explain how they do what they do, the CEO, I see them lean back looking at this person going, I had absolutely no idea. This is how this process evolved. I did not know this is how we do this. And for that reason, they oftentimes love, leaders in these companies love when someone like you and I come in and we ask all these detailed questions, because it allows them to understand their business in ways that they never even knew before themselves.
Could not agree more. So I'm going to, add one more layer related to the whole order management piece, and there could be a little confusion, I guess. And I'm going to take this conversation just a little bit to, B2C. I know that this conversation is related to B2B, but people sort of get confused because they look at retail. Sometimes they are going to come from retail, and now they are working in B2B, and they are trying to bring all of those habits. Now, these two business models are completely different. So in retail, you are often going to find that, ERP does not hold the state of your order. Okay, it might not even hold the state of your inventory. Okay, literally, I mean, see, if you go to any apparel shop or let's say fashion or whatever, right? The entire inventory is probably held inside their POS layer or some sort of, Blue Yonders of the world, because they are able to do the WMS, the whole order routing, splitting, whatever they need to do, allocation, inventory, everything is held there. Because the reason for that is because for them, the cost is not as much of the product. And I think that I mentioned last time as well, that cost and the definition of the inventory is going to be the driver where you are going to keep the order, which system is going to hold the state of the order. Okay. In B2B, you have a lot more dependencies. Okay. You have different channels, the kind of, pricing structure you are going to have. So you require that centralized state. You require centralized state if you are also going to have costing layers that are going to be equally relevant. You are going to have your buyers involved and they impact your pricing. In retail, the pricing is very different. So these two are two completely different world. And if you're simply going to inherit what is happening inside B2C, you are going to have fun challenges. By the way, don't get me started on business models that are going to have B2C plus B2B, which is very common.
Yeah, well, as we pointed out, I mean, your example is a prime example of one of the key differences in data models between B2B and B2C. In the B2C world, price is an attribute of the product. In B2B, price is an attribute of the customer. So price lists are attributes of the customer. They are linked to the customer record. And so what's interesting about this is that, and this leads to the next point, which is, okay, cool. I need to basically get down on paper or digital paper what all of my business processes are today that we expect or think or assume that the ERP should own or touch, right? So this goes back to that silver bullet model that a lot of people have. They have the assumption that, hey, I'm going to implement SAP or I'm going to implement NetSuite or whatever it is. And that's going to solve all of my operational challenges in the business. It's going to make me overnight, is going to make me operationally efficient. Now, the challenge with that assumption is that it's often simply wrong.
Yeah.
Because if we haven't already created a scalable process, or at least a roadmap to a scalable process in the business using human beings, simply automating an inefficient process doesn't suddenly make it efficient. And this is the real challenge, is that oftentimes when I'm called in to explore what an ERP might look like for our business, and I'm sure you get the same, the first thing I have to tell them is, this isn't just a opportunity to automate what you're already doing. This is an opportunity to interrogate what you're doing and see if there is a way to improve it that then makes it more scalable before we ever bring in technology to take over this process inside the business. And sometimes if a B2B business has been doing things the same way for literally 3 generations, and I've seen this more than one time, where, a family-owned business, we're now in the 3rd generation of leadership in the company. Grandfather, grandmother founded the company, grandson, granddaughter took it over, or son and daughter took it over, and now we're on to the grandchild of the founders that are now coming in, and they're coming in as the CEO or the COO or the CMO or the CSO, whatever it is, and all of a sudden they go, well, this is great, granddad and grandma, that we've always done it this way, and it's great that we've built these relationships with our customers and that they trust us and they love us. But our new buyers are millennials, right? And our new buyers are Gen Z, and they expect things to be much more automated, and they expect to be able to access information themselves, and they expect to get information in a much more timely fashion. And if we go from a model where everything's done manually and everything's in people's heads, and we discussed the concept of tribal and institutional knowledge on our first call. We discussed the fact that in most of these businesses, there's 1 or 2 people in each department that just know how everything works. They are what I like to call the linchpin. They are the linchpin of procurement. They're the linchpin of finance. They're the linchpin of whatever role they're doing in the business, right? They're the linchpin of customer service, or they're the linchpin of sales. And they have done something a certain way because they had no other choice, usually. They had no other choice. They didn't know what was possible. And so therefore, they have a lot of tribal knowledge up here about maybe even shortcuts that they use to be able to get through their day faster. Okay, cool, I know this shortcut where I can get this piece of information off of a shared network drive that I need then to attach to an email and send to my customer. And I can do that really fast because I know how to identify where this is located. And so if we can't document all that tribal knowledge to begin with, then how the hell can we convert it into a digital or automated equivalent?
Exactly. And even if you are able to do that, I think you are going to find a lot of surprises because the story is never going to be aligned. Everybody is going to have their own versions of what they are expecting out of the system. And then even if you are able to go live, you can go live. Nobody stops you. Okay, you can cut the cake, celebrate, but then you have to use it. And then you are going to find it very different than what you were expecting. And then what is going to happen is everybody's sort of going to hijack the processes. They have to complete the job. It's going to be 9 to 5. They have to go home. Nobody's going to be there after 5. So they have to find their ways. And this is where we see a lot of adoption challenges. If you sort of short circuit that process in the beginning, and that's why the point that you are trying to make is you have to have some version of documentation that is telling a consistent story. I'm not saying that you have to design these fancy diagrams that don't make any sense, I guess. But you have to have some version of the story that everybody can follow, everybody is aligned, and everybody has some understanding that they are agreeing to it. Obviously, there are always going to be surprises because even if you feel that everybody sort of have this down. But then you will find in the implementation phase, no. What I understood was very different, because there are always going to be layers to these things. It's very hard to visualize, these processes, especially if you have not lived on a similar system or processes. So you will always find the challenges, but you have to build that state to be able to plan your project, to be able to select the right tools, to be able to streamline, the implementation, to find out, what is going to be your final budget. Otherwise, you are flying blind, in my personal experience.
And this also leads me to my next point, which I'd love your thoughts on, which is, if we cannot understand the current state, or let's put it this way, we cannot design the future state if we can't fully understand the current state. We really need to deeply understand how we are doing things today if we can start thinking about how we would improve them tomorrow. And it also leads back to one of the next points that we'll discuss, which is how we even set or define our platform selection criteria. Because what I do is, when I go in and I'm helping with any kind of enterprise software selection, right?
Yeah.
I try to base my recommendations on the 80-20 rule. Let's go out to market. Let's try to find systems that, out of the box, with light configuration and low or no customization, will be able to meet at least 80% of your needs out of the box, right?
Yeah.
That we implement it and boom, we plug it in, we turn it on, and with very, very little customization, with very little configuration, this is going to be immediately beneficial and useful for your business. But the problem is, someone like you or me cannot come in and help assess the 80-20 rule, or help to define which platforms and technologies should be in your consideration set if we do not understand what constitutes the 80%, meaning what is it that we're actually mapping to a piece of technology? What capabilities, what processes, what data models need to be supported in this new world? And that starts to create the selection criteria framework. But if the company is not clear on what that 80% is, then you and I cannot help map them from where they are to where they want to get to, correct?
Yeah. So I guess, in our world, and I'll make two comments, I guess. One is going to be on the as a state. So you mentioned that, obviously you need to document it. And let's say, as consultants, even if we are able to skip that process, okay, there is a very strong possibility that the people would not be able to follow along, or they will not be able to understand the to be state. Okay. So it's almost like, Jason, let's say right now we both are speaking English, decent English, I guess, that both of us can understand. We don't have to use a translator. So now, let's say, for whatever reason, let's say I didn't know any English. Okay, I knew Chinese, and now we are trying to communicate. What will be the process of communication? Let's say right now, we have translator, we have coaching classes, whatever. Let's say if this did not exist, how do you facilitate that process? So you have to find some sort of common ground. And in general, the common ground is going to be the common language that you develop to be able to communicate. How do you do that, right? So generally, if you watch any movies where somebody was teaching some sort of, language to a person who came from, a foreign world, the way they would do this is by, either some sort of visual cues or some sort of sound, that they will try to somehow, figure this out. That is the process of that as is. Even if you are able to sort of figure out the to be process, even if I document the to be process, you need to develop that common language. The common language is going to be as is and to be, so that you can do as is and to be comparison the way they are going to do in the marketing world, when they are going to see, hey, this is my, before and this is my after. That is the importance of that. Now, going back to your comment related to 80-20, and what is that 80%? Okay, sometimes that 20% could cause a lot of headache as well. Okay, so and that's why I like to define the 80 and 20 as well. Okay, in my personal view, and generally the way we approach this is, okay, we generally try to find the critical success factors, and those critical success factors are not going to be obvious to an user. From the user perspective, their requirements are going to be, hey, I'm looking for something easy to use. I'm looking for something very secure. I am looking for, and these two are completely conflicting requirements.
Something super scalable, for example.
Something super scalable. Yeah, something that is, I don't have to spend too much time, I guess, to learn. These are going to be the user's needs. Now, these needs have very little relevance if you look at this more from the project management perspective. Okay, if you look at the what are the odds of the implementation success? Literally zero correlation. Zero correlation. In fact, if you are going to pay attention to these requirements, it's very likely that you will fail because you are paying attention to something that does not matter at all. It's going to mislead you. It's going to lead you to ignore the factors that has real weight on your implementation. So
Well,
unless
and sorry to interrupt. And those factors are often transient or subjective, meaning that
exactly,
it might be, okay, my current CFO considers something easy to use if it does these three things, right? But if that is not business critical, but it's critical to them and
yeah,
they think that's what's going to make them more efficient,
yeah,
they're probably not going to always be your CFO. They're probably not going to always be in the business. And that assessment of ease of use is oftentimes a very subjective
yeah,
assessment. So what
yeah,
constitutes easy to use for you might constitute massively complex for someone else. And so I think what you're referring to is, let's try to take as much subjectivity out of the equation as we
exactly,
possibly can
yeah.
when we're trying to assess the 80%.
Exactly, exactly. And I'll give you an example of how to think in what the kind of critical success factors that we are generally including. And the number one critical success factor that we like to coach to these people is okay, the first critical success factor is always going to be aligned to number one, your budget, number two, your skill set, and number three is going to be whether it is ever going to be successful. If it is not going to be successful, then it doesn't matter, guys. Okay, so some of the examples of the critical success factors that we look at is things such as your parent-child relationship between your customers and vendors, and the way your product data is going to be related to your customers. Now you have to analyze these relationships in your current model, the way your transactions are structured at this point of time. Now, if you have a non-negotiable position in those transactions for whatever reason, either the guy who's the linchpin, I think that is the term that he used, and he's not willing to move for whatever reason. Okay, so now that becomes the constraint in the system. So everything, the whole system organization is going to be around this constraint, even if that is going to be $1 million mistake. So now you have to analyze everything just because of this constraint that you are not willing to move. Now it's going to be $1 million. And right now, my confidence is probably going to be 0.01% because I don't know whether it is going to be a million or it could be more. Because each of these decisions could fire back later on. So the critical success factors that we are looking at are very, 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 very deep into implementation, and that somebody who is doing these implementations, somebody like Jason or Sam, they can forecast those. A user will never know how to forecast these things. So again, going back to the things that matter, from the selection perspective, these are very, 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 very deep into implementation. As consultants, what we are trying to do is we are literally trying to implement this in our head when we are trying to select. It's that hard. Even we will not be able to see a lot of things. So we need to forecast all of that. Okay, we are trying to forecast that on a piece of paper, whether this is going to react when we are going to build this. So that's the kind of forecasting that we are doing, and we are trying to decide from the critical success factor perspective.
I think one of the other things that, from a success factor perspective, I have seen over and over and over again is that the businesses that are willing to change processes where it makes sense to leverage out of the box workflows in a given enterprise software, those are the situations where I see the most success, the highest rates of adoption and usage, the lowest project failure, etc., is when a business says, hey, we don't know everything.
Yeah.
And we're not wedded. Okay, maybe we've got one or two processes that we're wedded to and are sacred cows, and we don't touch those because they fundamentally make us who we are as a business.
Yeah.
But every other process, we're willing to be flexible around. And by flexible, I mean almost every enterprise software, especially ERP, has a very default way of doing things, whether it's lead to cash, whether it's revenue recognition, whether it's order management, whether it's CRM, whatever it is. It's kind of got an out-of-the-box way of looking at those data points and structuring them in a certain way to manage a transaction all the way from origination through to completion. Okay. And so I always tell brands when I'm working with them and businesses when I'm working with them, the more flexible you are able to be around adapting, tweaking. It doesn't have to be major changes. It might only be minor changes. But the more flexible you are able to be around adopting standard out-of-the-box workflows within these systems, the better off you will be. And you will launch with lower rates of technical debt. You will launch with a system that is easier to maintain. You will launch with a system that is easier to extend. You will launch with a system that is going to cost you less, not only to implement, but long-term, because all of a sudden now, instead of having all these custom processes and business logic existing in the system, now we're using default business logic in these systems. So give me your take on the kind of conversations you have around this with businesses that you deal with, and trying to get them to understand the value in interrogating their processes and saying, hey, unless it's a sacred cow, let's adopt the out-of-the-box process.
Yeah, so I guess the conversations in our experience, if we have this conversation that out of the box versus 80/20 or whatever, those conversations in our experience, they don't go as well. So what we generally do is, to be completely honest, it's a very therapeutic process, right? So we try to teach them the ERP concepts, because obviously 90% of the customers are not going to understand what the hell is this, why are we doing this. Okay, so for example, one of the things that you mentioned is ERPs, they have a certain way of doing things. Okay, so the reason why they have certain way of doing things is because these companies have analyzed the supply chain, the operational processes, and they have tried to streamline everything, based on the study of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 different businesses. And operations is all about streamlining things, because the more streamlined you are going to be, the faster your transactions are going to be. And that's where you are going to get the real differentiator. It's not that you have to create your unique processes. That's not where you get the differentiator. You get the differentiator when you are going to have the shorter lead time with your transactions. So going back to the conversations, I guess, so one thing that we do or feel is, once you have gone through the whole training process, meaning you have to open their eyes. Okay, what is a customer master? What is the item master? Why these things matter? Why do you need to correlate the chart of accounts? And if you need to correlate chart of accounts at the customer level as well as at the product level, what are going to be implications for Joe, for Jason, for Mary, for everybody in the game. So we are sort of trying to do a little bit of modeling from the as and to be perspective, but we are also coaching them the ERP concepts, and there are going to be like millions and millions of ERP concepts that they have to learn. And unless they learn that, they will not be able to see why we are saying, okay, these 10 critical success factors are the most important. They are always going to be hung up on those, factors, the subjective factors that we were talking about in the beginning, and then they are going to have interesting results. So the whole process is very training centric, I would say, but it's also a therapy because unless they see it, they need to visualize it. And the worst part is that, let's say, if you are expediting this process and you are going to go to these screens directly in a demo, you are going to feel that no, it looks easy, system looks easy, it looks pretty great. Once you start using that, it's gonna be fun, because it's a very different experience. Okay, even if they looked prettier during the demo or easier during the demo, it's not going to be same experience when you are going to use it. So that's where you need to forecast all of this and then translate that into a learning, because once you look at the screen, it becomes a very frightening experience even for consultants. Okay, it's that hard. I struggle even today, to be completely honest, to go from screen number 1 to screen number 2 in an ERP system. And not just ERP system, any enterprise system that you are going to talk about, even CRM. Some people complain about Salesforce. The only reason why Salesforce is hard is because they are trying to maintain the layered hierarchies as well. That's why some people feel that, okay, HubSpot has too many layers, Salesforce has too many layers. It has layers because you need layers. That's how you get the modularity in your transactions. That's how you make your transactions scalable. Generally, the systems that are claiming we are easy, what they are doing is they are truncating the whole process. They are removing those layers, and they just have one or two or three fold, meaning you are only going to have so many different permutations and combination in this piece of paper. It's as simple. It's simple math. So tomorrow, let's say if you are going to have a unique transaction, you are going to struggle. And the reason why you have these multi-fold hierarchy, three-dimensional, I don't know, maybe seven-dimensional, maybe eight-dimensional inside ERP is because it is designed to support many transactions, many business models, many different processes, but you have to do it right way. Once you take one wrong path, then again, you are going to have interesting results.
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, it gets down to the point where oftentimes what I've seen with enterprise software is we go out of our way to hide navigation items, to hide screens, to hide as much as we can, literally, and many ERPs with permission sets, roles and permissions, with a combination of roles and permissions, we now can streamline this to the point where, okay, the financial controller doesn't need to see necessarily, okay, maybe the financial controller is probably the one person that probably needs to see just about everything. But other than that, there's many other people in the business that only need to see a very, very tiny subset of the data in the ERP. So if it's the warehouse person, or if it's the procurement person, or if it's the marketing person, or if it's the sales rep, or whatever it might be, oftentimes they only need to see a very, very tiny subset of the capability of the platform. And by abstracting out all the things that they don't need access to and they don't need to see, it by definition, we get this, we get paralysis by analysis, right? And the problem is that when we have access to too many things, it becomes overwhelming really, really quickly. And if we, for example, if we limit the items in a menu that a sales rep can see, for example, down to the tickets, maybe the help desk, the service desk, the tickets, maybe everything to do with the sales process, maybe everything to do with price lists, everything to do with customer records, and that's it. And from lead to cash, and that they can only see everything related to that process, then oftentimes in my experience, that is the area where we can optimize the user experience by through a very strict enforcement of roles, policies, and rules and permissions. We now can get people out of the weeds and into the things that matter to them quickly.
Could not agree more. I think that's a great point. And in fact, the complications that you have inside the ERP is because of that reason, because you have million layers of workflow, security, the number of roles that it can support, and each of the fields as well as the screens, you can literally hide. And as long as you're hiding, that's not necessarily customization, to be completely honest, because it's still there.
That's configuration. It's not customization, it's configuration.
Most ERP systems can support that. The smaller systems may not be able to support, but you are actually going to open another can of worms. So I want to caution that a little bit. Okay, so here, if you are going to do that, now you are going to get into the real workflow security errors. So sometimes you might not be seeing something because it might be because of that workflow security issue, because you enable that. So now you have to debug a lot more, because sometimes that you might complain that maybe this is the software, but it is not the software, because you chose to customize so much. I'm using the word customization, but in this particular case, it could be configuration. You are doing that. And by the way, you have to test this a lot as well, because this is going to be a unique requirement. So that increases time. Now, if your timeline is going to be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, I don't know. Now this testing itself could take a long time. In 90% of the cases, Jason, I don't know what has been your experience. When you go through the go live process, okay, 90% of the cases, your issues are going to be just around permissions. Some people are not able to see the screen. Some people are not able to see the menus. They are just not getting it, right? So those are going to be the issues that you are going to find, because when you are telling them, hey, you need to test, then they would not test. They will not take it seriously. They will say that, I have tested. It's all good. But things are not going to work day one. So that's where you find a lot of issues as well. So that would be my comment related to workflow security. One more comment in comparing different systems. For example, let's say if you look at HubSpot. HubSpot has only 3 layers. of the workflow security, not more than that. Salesforce is going to have more because Salesforce is a much bigger system. So in HubSpot, you are going to find individual team, and what is the other one? Probably they call it admin or sysadmin, whatever. Yeah. So they just have three layers. So basically you have 3 layers of hierarchy. You need to somehow map your teams to that organization, and if you have more, that means you have outgrown HubSpot. Okay, it doesn't matter how cool HubSpot is. Now with ERP, you are looking at finance, procurement, sales, operations, AR, AP. I don't know how many different roles. So that's why
marketing, etc.
Exactly, because everybody's sort of trying to sing the same song, and that's why it becomes so complex, to be completely honest. But again, this is where you are going to get the real operational efficiency, because everything is going to be connected. So you are not going to get as many surprises when you are playing in silos.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly this level of detail that we're getting into here. It seems overly granular, it seems overly prescriptive, but based on what we're seeing literally in the trenches every single day of helping businesses onboard these enterprise class systems, these are literally the types of conversations businesses need to be having internally before they even bring in somebody like you and me. Like, if they really want to set themselves up for success, start interrogating your processes today. Start interrogating your data today. Start interrogating what's a must-have versus a nice-to-have versus a wish list. Interrogate what level of permission structure do we think as a bare minimum we need to be able to operate our business. How do we think we can simplify processes today that are overly complex? How do we interrogate those in such a way that we realistically say, okay, this piece of the process was implemented 5 years ago because of a business, a client that we were dealing with at the time, and those aren't even a client anymore. So do we really need that extra step in the process because that client isn't even a client of ours anymore? Do we need to do all the things we're doing today, and do we need to do them the way we are doing them today? And if we could, and I always try to say, try to think about, just like I try to think about the customer experience as in my customer's customer experience, I also try to ask them, in a perfect world, if you could snap your fingers tomorrow, forget about the tech, forget about the processes, forget about, let's not think about any of that stuff for this moment. If you could snap your fingers and have a system that could do anything you wanted and could run any process you wanted, any way you wanted it, what would that look like? What does a perfect world? Now, we may not be able to get you to a perfect world scenario, but we may be able to get you close. So in a perfect world, if you could snap your fingers and tomorrow have a system that worked the way you wanted it to work, what would that look like? So I try to unshackle their mind. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a pattern interrupt when I ask those kinds of questions. I'm trying to pattern interrupt them away from the way they do things today and the way they think about things today. And sometimes when you ask an outlandish question like that and say, throw off all the limitations. If you could literally snap your fingers at no cost and make your business operate the way you want to operate it tomorrow, what would that look like in a perfect world? And then we work back from the perfect world backwards and we say, how close can we get you to that perfect world? So what are the types of things you do to help pattern interrupt the thinking of your clients to help them start having a bigger vision than what they have today?
Yeah, so in our experience, again, it's a very iterative process. So we sort of build these models and we take them through the journey. And we are trying to, so when we are building these models, we are trying to show them that, okay, this is what we have as of today, based on whatever we discussed. These are different critical success factors that we have identified so far. Now, these are going to be the implications based on whatever we have discussed. So now this gets them talking that, okay, hey, you know what? I can see some issue in this particular process because for whatever reason in their head, that might be different, right? So then we are doing a conversation just like this, and we are discovering a lot of details that, hey, you never told me this. So now
I didn't know about that one.
Exactly. So now we have an implication. So in our heads, when we are having these conversations, it's almost like going to a therapist and starting from your childhood. And sometimes you are going to wonder, why the hell are you asking me to start from childhood? Can you give me some strategies here?
Yeah, is this
Right?
relevant? Why is this relevant? How is this relevant?
Exactly. So what we are doing in this process is we are trying to detect, we are trying to map in our heads, and we are trying to figure out, okay, where are you deviating? Something that is going to look off from our perspective. We are sort of trying to flag, okay, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. What's going on there? Is it off? And generally, I mean, we don't have to dig into every single process. it's going to be those deviations. And those deviations, for example, the way you are, printing your SKUs, the way your SKU to your lot numbers are correlated, it could be anything. It could be anything, but that may have impact on my target model. And you are going to assume a target model from a specific perspective. Every single system out there, whether you are going to get, I don't care whether NetSuite, SAP, Acumatica, whatever system you are going to get, Sin 7, it doesn't matter. They are going to have a very specific state in their system. So we are sort of assuming that, okay, this is the architecture that we are trying to build. This is the data model that I have based on my understanding of the target state. So I am trying to align as much as possible to the target state based on my understanding. Right now, if you are going to change any variable, okay, so we have this configuration, we are looking for maybe NetSuite, okay, we are going to throw in HubSpot here, we are going to throw in Shopify here, we are going to throw in, I don't know, 20 different systems. Great idea, do it. Okay, but anytime you are going to have these deviations that we are talking about during the conversation, in our heads we are trying to build this state. Okay, the data is going to move from your system 1 to system 2 to 3, and then we are trying to forecast, okay, hopefully this is going to work. At least that's what I have in my head, right? That, okay, I don't see any issues, keep going, but if I see any deviations, that's where I'm going to flag it out. Okay, tell me more. And if this does not fit my state, the state that I am trying to build as part of the overarching architecture, then we need to revise the process model, the data model, and then finally enterprise architecture. And then you are going to have change in your critical success factors as well, which actually drives your selection process.
And I'm going to give another practical example of a scenario that I've run into with wholesale distribution in particular that is a little bit unique to wholesale distribution, and we have to cater for this in the data model around products. Yeah. And so I just want to talk about practical examples of where when I go in and I start doing these discoveries, these businesses, they take it for granted that everyone does it exactly like they do, okay? And they just assume, well, doesn't every wholesale distributor do it exactly like us? Like, isn't this just, they don't think they're anything special, okay? But I'll give you an example where a data model question becomes absolutely intrinsic to how they both buy products and to how they sell products. So they might, in their system, they have an internal SKU. So that is the master number or letters or whatever it is related to a product. When it comes into the warehouse, I scan it in. This is the SKU in my system. Now, oftentimes their suppliers, which are oftentimes manufacturers or master distributors, they will have an MPN, a manufacturer's part number, or a source part number. Now that oftentimes is completely different to their internal SKU. Now, their customers will sometimes have their own part number for their SKU in their system. And in order to be able to reconcile in their system when they receipt the product and on the invoice, when they do their reconciliation, the buyer wants their part number on the invoice, not just your SKU. They want their part number on the invoice. And when I buy it in, I need the supplier's part number on the invoice so that I have a chain of record that links together the MPN, my SKU, and my buyer's part number. Okay. And that all needs to live in my ERP system, and they need to be cross-referenceable in my system so that, for example, when I start to push out my data to an e-commerce platform, for example, I want, when someone comes to my website, when a buyer comes to my website and they search by their part number in their system, my SKU, my matching cross-reference SKU needs to turn up in the results. Now, this is something that, unless you've worked in the wholesale distribution world, you wouldn't even know to ask that question, because in the retail world, for example, a SKU is a SKU is a SKU. Like, we got one product, this is the SKU, and this is the SKU I'm selling, and this is the price I'm selling it at. In the wholesale distribution world, there is usually MPN, my SKU, my buyer's SKU, or my buyer's part number, and those have to have a logical linkage inside my system for all sorts of purposes, right? And so it's these types of questions that you wouldn't know to ask if you've only ever worked in the B2C and D2C world. You wouldn't even know to ask that kind of question of a wholesale distribution client.
And generally what we see is what companies are going to do, especially if they don't understand, or if you have a consultant who does not have as deep understanding of the data model of the ERP, they are going to code this and they are going to develop some sort of process. Now, this is all pre-baked in most decent ERPs. Uh,
Yes.
if you are going to have QuickBooks, you are probably never going to get that. It might not be possible, because there is no correlation. So the process is called vendor cross reference is what you are referring to, right? So that is
Yes.
going to be mapped at the item level itself inside the ERP.
Yes.
I don't know, maybe Sin7 has that as well, because they probably would require, but then you are not going to have the financial correlation. That's where they
Yes.
sort of, cut the corners. So
And you're
everybody's
not going to
getting,
have the customer part number correlation. That's the one thing that is often missing, because that has to be at the account level, right? And so oftentimes that correlation doesn't exist in the ERP. Now most ERPs will allow you to create that record and cross-reference and link it together through a custom piece of business logic. But if the ERP isn't flexible enough to be able to do that, well, then if that's a absolute base requirement for you as a business, because you're a wholesale distribution business, well, then you can't include that ERP in your consideration set, because it is fundamental to the way you sell your products to your customers.
could not agree more. I think you have a great point.
So I think that, to wrap this up, and again, we've come down, an hour has absolutely flown by yet again. I think what we're talking about here is that before we can even start getting into the technical considerations around an ERP, meaning on-prem versus cloud native versus cloud managed, ease of implementation, user experience, ability to integrate internal and external systems, those are all absolute key considerations of ERP selection. But if the even over and above all that, if an ERP cannot support core data endpoints and core business processes that are absolutely essential for you to even be able to do business, then those are the things we have to identify first. And that has to begin with these businesses trying to do even a basic diagramming of their processes. It could be, I don't care. Do it in a Google Sheet, do it in Excel, do it in Visio, do it in whatever, do it in Miro, do it in whatever platform you are most comfortable doing that in, but get it down, get it out of people's heads, get it into some format that somebody like you and me can come in and we can ask questions. Okay, I don't understand this process. I don't understand it. Can you help me understand it? Because I don't understand it. Oh, this point where there's a choice to be made in the process, help me understand what is the logic behind this choice or this order routing or whatever it is. So if they can get something at least basic down on paper, then it's up to people like you and me to interrogate that more where it doesn't make sense to us. Because if it doesn't make sense to us, it's not going to make sense to the vendor, and it's not going to make sense when we implement it. So these are the things that I think are mission critical to kicking off the selection process as part of what I would consider ERP basics. Is you got to document your processes, your data models first before you ever, we can help you do that, sure, but you still got to do that work inside. We can't do that work on your behalf. And so I would say before you even hire somebody like you and me, get that stuff documented, because it's going to make the process faster and it's going to make it a shitload cheaper for you as a manufacturer, wholesaler, or distributor. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up this particular episode around ERP for B2Bs?
So I don't know. How much you want to dig into. Obviously, this could go on for hours, I guess.
And it will in the next episodes.
Exactly. But right now, I think we have provided enough, from the selection perspective in terms of how to look for critical success factors. But understanding different ERP systems, they all have a place in the market. They all are designed for a very specific state of the transactions. So aligning that, really understanding, okay, which ERP systems are going to be right fit for you, that's where you are going to probably find the real value.
I really appreciate your time, Sam. Cannot wait for our next conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm looking forward, for the next episode.
Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.